to complete our view of the Angry 40s, I feel compelled to compare our spine, that of Simon Heffer's High Minds, against a text of the left. When one heads out into life and general discourse, you will come up against this sort of new left view of history. The counterweight to Heffer I've chosen is Raymond Williams' Culture and Society, which overlaps in many of the years Heffer deals with, but Culture and Society was published in 1958, and from Williams' Marxist cultural critique, it marks it really as a text whose general view of history would become ascendant in subsequent decades. Culture and Society begins slightly earlier than Heffer's High Minds, the former in the 1780s, the latter in the 1830s. By the time we've reached the 1830s in Williams's work, he's already laid his foundation of Owenite sympathy and romantic idealism, leading to Rousseau's noble savage syndrome. Williams introduces Carlyle on the back of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Coleridge and the Romantics, though, are an antidote to the industrial dilemma, not necessarily a Rousseauian or Benthamite. Williams already corrupted this romantic response before he gets to these dates, so it's important to note that. The dislocation of the Romantics with industrialism is with the beauty and destruction of the natural world, and the dehumanization aspect of industrialism. Carlyle's feudal sympathies and nostalgias aren't necessarily at odds with this, so Williams will try and cast Carlyle as the aloof madman, the guy out of key with the changes that needed to be required to the nation. But as we've seen earlier, what the left deem feudal nostalgia, this was actually giving better critiques than the black and white your class versus our class leftist view. Williams quotes the following from Carlyle as proto-Marxist, and it's sort of how he introduces him as a character. Quote, "What changes too this addition of power is introducing into the social system, how wealth has more and more increased and at the same time gathered itself more and more into the masses, strangely altering the old relations and increasing the distance between rich and poor, will be a question for political economists, and a much more complex and important one than any they have yet engaged with." But Carlyle continues his analysis in another Arnoldian direction. "Not the external and physical alone," he says, "is now managed by machinery, but the internal and spiritual also. The same habit regulates not our modes of action alone, but our modes of thought and feeling. Men are grown mechanical in head and in heart, as well as in hand. They have lost faith in individual endeavour, and in natural force of any kind, not for internal perfection, but for the external combinations and arrangements, for institutions, constitutions, for mechanism of one sort or the other, do they hope and struggle. Their whole efforts, attachments, opinions turn on mechanism, and are of a mechanical character." Why Culture and Society is it, does it say Carlyle then came from the Marxist lens? It's proto-Marxist. Why not see Marxism, rather, through the Carlylean lens? Engels and Marx both sculpted their views of history and class from an England which did not revolt, as I outlined in the second video of this series. Engels published his condition of the working class in England in 1845. In Germany, though, it would take subsequent decades before it got an English translation. Whereas John Bright, sort of liberal, saw open contract between worker and master, Engels saw fierce competition between workers as a tool to be used by the industrialists and to exploit the worker. These are both material takes, either material cooperation or exploitation. Carlyle casts the wider net. He encapsulates the full spirit of the age by bringing in the Thomas Arnold Christian character element, the spiritual struggle. From the perspective of Williams, though, as a Marxist writing in the second half of the 20th century, the fundamental axiom of Bentham still looms large. Bentham defined the fundamental axiom of his philosophy, the principle that it is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong. So building on Bentham's utilitarian ideal and developing it into scientific methodology of John Stuart Mill, with his net impulse for liberty, this will inevitably brush up against any pre-existing power structure. For the left, this power structure becomes an arbitrary power at best, or a manipulative autocracy at worst. Marxism for Williams is then seen as an antidote to the arbitrary power, and it appeals still to the scientific nature in the mechanical man, which Carlyle has told us is now one who is evolving at rapid pace. One has discovered a system of society which can now be manipulated to achieve the utilitarian or Marxist end. And Williams, at this point in English history, doesn't see the two as bifurcated. Here he is on Mill. From the thesis of Bentham through the antithesis of Coleridge, there becomes a new synthesis through Mill, largely moved through his Coleridgean influence. No two thinkers can be more entirely at variance than the two we have supposed worshippers of civilization and of independence. The present and the remote past, said Mill. But Rousseau's noble savage, and its subsequent interpretation, seen as an antidote to the industrial dilemma, is a corruption of the romantic response, as we've already said. Yet Mill continued to add Bentham to his Coleridge. Mill, quote, "By Bentham, beyond all others, men have been led to ask themselves, in regard to any ancient or received opinion, is it true? And by Coleridge, what is the meaning of it?" Well, Coleridge mentions the matter of time preference in the individual, though, in his works on society. Here's Coleridge. "You disclaim all connection with me, have I no claims upon you? I can then have no duties towards you, and this pistol shall put me in possession of your wealth." So on the backdrop of all of this, Williams comes in. Mill was far too intelligent to suppose that the deficiencies of a particular system, here Benthamism, or any sort of argument against system as such, the emphasis on culture, Mill decided, was the way to enlarge the utilitarian tradition. So Mill fuses Coleridge's idea of culture with Bentham's utilitarianism, and culture comes from Coleridge's idea of cultivation and the national church that he envisioned. Williams says where Burke had found the condition satisfied within the traditional organization of society, Coleridge found the condition threatened under the impact of change. Coleridge's response for an endowed class whose business should be general cultivation are worth noting. He calls this class clerisy or national church. Quote, "In its primary acceptation and original intention comprehended the learned of all denominations, the sages and professors of all the so-called liberal arts and sciences." Coleridge saw this as the third estate. And here's Mill. By setting in a clear light what a national church establishment ought to be, he has pronounced it the severest satire upon what, in fact, it is. This is the incorrect opinion, though, taken by Mill, even though Williams, writing about Mill on Coleridge and Bentham, thinks it's a clever realization. Because Coleridge, although he had a vision of perfection, does not mean that what he saw already in existence as worthy of satire. Williams saw Mill's later work dominated by two factors: his extension of the methods and claims of utilitarian reform to the interests of the rising working class, and his effort to reconcile the democratic control with individual liberty in turn had its influence upon Fabianism. Enter then Williams's take on Thomas Carlyle. He introduces us to Carlyle with Sign of the Times, 1829. Carlyle's first essay on social thought. The influence of German thought from the previous 40 years is clear. Goethe, Schiller, Novalis. Carlyle had met Coleridge. A hint from the latter becomes a position in the former. Quote, "Were we required to characterize this age of ours by any single epithet, we should be tempted to call it not an heroical, devotional, philosophical, or moral age, but above all, a mechanical age. It is the age of machinery, in every outward and inward sense of that word. Nothing new is now done directly or by hand. All is ruled by calculating contrivance." But Williams says Mill is the one who's sensible here, whereas a Carlyle or even a Ruskin is, to quote Williams, patently absurd. But that's for reasons he doesn't seem to flesh out. It's easy for us to conclude, in Williams's turn, that it is Mill's enlarged, humanized utilitarianism that was the best outcome that people could have wished for. From the Williams perspective, romantic poetry was an attempt to create a culture of feeling. It's from Coleridge and later from Ruskin, the construction of culture in terms of the arts may be seen to originate. Ruskin and Carlyle nurtured from Coleridge a very different set of principles than of Mill, one which Williams outright rejects. So Carlyle, or later a Ruskin, annoy the left by taking a different cultural inheritance from Coleridge and his want of a cultural feeling or national church throughout. Chartism, then, where does that come in? Well, Chartism was a method seen by Williams as emancipation of this new underclass, the working class, from the arbitrary power. Williams believed that the Chartist insurrection against the old parliamentary procedure was a sign of emancipation that could happen on a class political scale. Democracy, at this point not sufficiently at odds with his Marxism, either, not sufficiently corrupted by bourgeois notions. But Carlyle saw the ultimate failure of Williams's vision and the left's vision. It preempts the materialism effect even on the digital age. And here's Carlyle. Quote, so devoted are we to this principle and at the same time so curiously mechanical that a new trade, specially grounded on it, has arisen among us under the name of codification, or code-making in the abstract, whereby any people for a reasonable consideration may be accommodated with a patent code. And he also, Carlyle, predicts the great age of being perpetually offended. Our superior morality, he says, is properly rather an inferior criminality, produced not by greater love of virtue, but by greater perfection of police, and of that far subtler and stronger police called public opinion. In all senses we worship and follow after power. No man now loves truth as truth must be loved with an infinite love, but only with a finite love, and as it were par amour. Nay, properly speaking, he does not believe and know it, but only thinks it, and there is every probability. He reaches and preaches aloud, and rushes courageously forth, as if there is a multitude hurrahing, huzzahing at his back, yet every one keeps looking over his shoulder. The instant the huzzahing languishes, he stops short. Undue cultivation, says Carlyle, of the outward, again, though less immediately prejudicial, and even more, for the time productive of many palpable benefits, must in the long run be destroying moral force, which is the parent of all other force, prove not less pernicious. Carlyle wanted to see a restoration of balance, and it is strange that Williams quotes these passages of Carlyle in his book Culture and Society, yet seems to miss the point entirely. Carlyle. There is a deep-lying struggle in the whole fabric of society. We're too engaged in the struggle which had already ceased. The larger part of Carlyle's writing is the imaginative recreation of men of nobler power. Lacking live men, we enter a social contract with a biography. The illustrious dead. Carlyle realised that the living essence of Chartism was never put down. And perhaps it was his contempt for that essence which so rebuked Williams.